Oh! Now here comes Maya, walking backwards, pretty good, head down. Yeah, falling forward. And then Maya. Woohoo!
That was a nice backstage tuning in. Good morning once again to everybody who is watching us on YouTube and LinkedIn, probably Facebook as well. This is Japan Expert Insights and Japanese Politics One-on-One with Timothy Langley, the one and only. So thank you very much, Timothy, for being with us once again this morning. And I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. I know that you were waiting for the beginning of this briefing. So I'll give you the floor.
Okay.
Okay, you okay?
Whatever.
Okay, whatever. So let me just say that we have already announced that we're going to have our summer networking event next Friday. It's going to be in the evening starting at 4 o'clock. And if you haven't signed up yet, please do, because it consists of two separate events. One of them is a tour of the National Diet Building. And Timothy Langley is going to lead that tour. Of course, he's going to be chased by the guides there as well, or the guards as well. So that's also a nice thing to see, I believe. And after that, we'll have a dinner in Hibiya Park. Once again, everybody will be there. So if you haven't signed up, please let me know. You can do that with through the link, which I will share with you on different platforms. And that's all, Timothy. I said it all.
Okay.
It's you
Thank you
now.
very much. Thank you very much, Maya. Just by a show of hands, everybody raise your hand if you have ever been inside the parliament, if you've ever toured inside the parliament. I see Gabor, just a couple of hands. So listen, if you've never been inside the National Parliament building, I'll organize a tour. I am organizing a tour on Friday, this Friday. You need to be there before 4 o'clock so that I can get you in. You need to register with Maya so that I can get you through security. And I have about an hour walking tour. I've done this maybe hundreds of times for a lot of different kinds of groups and people, school kids, individuals, diplomats, that sort of thing. So it's really interesting. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn about politics and how policy is kind of masticated and eventually comes out to be laws, how laws are voted on, the emperor's role in Japanese parliamentary activities and that sort of thing. So please sign up for it. And then after this tour, we're going to walk about, 300 meters, Maya, 400 meters to a very pleasant outside patio where Maya has organized for a sit-down dinner with an open bar. And it's just going to be, a great time to interact with each other, schmooze, get to know each other a little bit better. This community that Maya's pulled together as a consequence of not just this briefing, but also her weekly discussions on Wednesday morning, and sometimes on Monday with Dr. Stephen Nagy. It's continuing to grow. And by the way, thank you very much for telling your friends and colleagues about what we're doing. Maya just reported to me that once again, last week on LinkedIn, the audience grew by about 300 people. So that's continuing to grow. And I think the largest number of people who are observing this briefing are on YouTube. And we can't really calculate the numbers there, but we know that it's growing by leaps and bounds. On Clubhouse, it's somewhat stable. We have a pretty regular audience on Clubhouse. LinkedIn is growing, and YouTube is expanding pretty quickly. So thanks very much for staying tuned, and welcome to today's briefing. Today is June 25th, 2023. Thank you very much for tuning in and listening to me talk about what's going on in Japanese politics that I find of critical importance and that are kind of indicators or precursors of things to come in the very near term. Mostly, as you know, if you've been listening regularly, is we talk about the Kishida administration or the prime minister, whoever that is, because given the hierarchical nature of Japanese politics, it kind of all comes to the top with the prime minister and his cabinet and filters down from there. So what goes on in Japanese internal political parties and in the factions within the LDP is very important. Who's on first base, who's on second base, and we'll get into that. And then the dynamics that kind of guide or dictate what the prime minister can do, how much flexibility he has. And so I'll get into those. I'll talk for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A. So one of the things that is hot on the radar right now is the Bank of Japan, what the new governor of the Bank of Japan intends to do with the currency rate, with the yield flows, that sort of thing. It is hitting the news now. Japan just was pulled off the watch list on yen transactions. The yen hit 143 on Friday. That is extremely low. The value of the yen being critical to the amount of money Japan pays for imports, and it has a preference for exports. So I guess you could say the fat cats, the people who are exporting in this economy, are making a windfall, and those who are importing, especially foodstuffs and energy-related products, plastics, that sort of thing, are the ones that are suffering for inputs into manufacturing process, that sort of thing. The Bank of Japan is worried about this because inflation continues to increase. The Bank of Japan has stated for the last 10 years under the Abe administration that they're targeting inflation to be at 2%. They just really haven't hit it. It has actually gone far beyond 2%. It is currently at about 4.3%. And the predictions were for June or for May that the numbers would be coming down. It would be around 3% this month. And they've missed those projections. The increase in the inflation rate has continued, and it's created a little bit of a ripple effect. And the Bank of Japan is considering its options. It could do one of two things. It could raise its inflation forecast, which it now predicts to be maybe 3.2% towards the end of this year, but it's right now at 3.2%. It's increased from what it was last year at 3.1%. And if you exclude energy, if energy is added to this 3.2, it goes up to 4.3. They've taken the energy out so that the numbers look a little bit better. But this is the highest inflation since 1981. So the Bank of Japan is very concerned about this. Their forecast is for 1.8% by March of next year. But that's, I don't know if that's really feasible. I don't know. One of the things that really increases the inflation rate is energy costs. And the government is taking about 20% of the subsidies that it pays for energy costs, for gasoline, for heating, for those kinds of costs. And they're creating a huge subsidy for that. 20% of that will fall out in August. So invariably, the inflation rate is going to go higher. And processed foods takes the largest portion of that. It's about 9.2%, and it's the biggest jump since 1975 for processed food to take that much of a huge jump of the inflation bite. So the other thing that is compounding this is that, as we've reported several times in this briefing, many of the companies request an authorization or approval for price increases. They get a stamp of approval or they get a nod from the central government. It is not required by law, but they do this as a natural consequence of trying to keep consumer prices in check, and also to not upset the market too much. But even with that, there are 3,500 products that are going up in price in June and July. So today's the 25th. July starts in another couple of days. Teikoku Data Bank reports on this. And so the impact to the Kishida administration is several-fold. You might remember that this time last week was almost a couple of days before the diet was to close down. There was some talk that the prime minister would extend the diet beyond the 23rd, which was Wednesday. He didn't do that. And the reason why he didn't do that is because not just the inflation targets and the bad reporting on his approval ratings, but also because the situation is just not ripe enough for him to call for a snap election and have any hope of coming out of it with more people in the LDP than before he called for a snap election. So he made a calculated bet there. And it's not just the inflation. It's not just energy or the products that are going up. It's also a lot of the political things that we're going to talk about here. Maya, you talked about before we signed on how hot it is today. It's been a beautiful weekend. I wish I had been able to get out on the water. But the Meteorological Agency has reported that we are indeed headed towards a El Nino, and it could be a super El Nino, which is a combination of factors, the La Nina, which is winding down, and the El Nino that is winding up, is predicted to kind of coalesce in August. So July is expected to be on par with temperatures last year, a little bit higher. September is supposed to be somewhat similar to what it was last year, which was pretty hot, but August is going to be a killer, they are predicting already. Energy costs will be going up, so people who have older people who really require air conditioning and that sort of thing are going to be suffering. And I think one of the reasons why the Prime Minister deferred from calling a snap election is if he called the snap election, I think it would have been kind of an acknowledgement that things are going to get bad before they get better. And he couldn't do that. So things are going to get bad before they get better, including the price of products going up, the subsidy for fuel coming down, going back up because the subsidy is going down. And a lot of the things that the Prime Minister has kind of pushed off, the cost of defense spending, the child care, that sort of thing, the numbers have not really come up. And you've noticed we talk about it, the Prime Minister being somewhat reluctant to kind of be very expansive about how it's going to be paid for. He's talked about the numbers, how much it's going to cost, but where the money is going to come from, he's been a little bit less descriptive. And that's kind of part of his shtick, because he's really grand on vision, but a little bit weak on providing numbers. And he did that for a purpose. But now with the Diet out of session, I think the rooster's going to come back to roost, and these details need to be addressed. The voting population is not going to be very happy about that. But he has had some successes, which I'd like to get into. But in any event, in Maebashi, Gunma Prefecture, in this weekend, they registered a 35.5 degrees Celsius, 30 degrees across Japan just this weekend. 1,843 people have been hospitalized for heat stroke related illness or attacks, and this is double the number from last week. So the week earlier there was a lot of rain, the typhoon had passed through, so you kind of expect that. But this week has been pretty dominant. It looks like we are going to be headed towards that a little bit more aggressively as we move into the summer. In fact, in India, they had 100 people died in the northeast in Bhojpur province, with a record of 45.3 degrees Celsius. So it's not just in Japan, but I think in other parts of Southeast Asia. Vietnam is suffering, Jakarta, Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka. They are all suffering from a heat wave that is going on. They've gotten it earlier than Japan has. And in fact, Japan, although we are in the rainy season, Tsuyu, it came earlier. And it looks like there will be more typhoons this year than there were last year. You might also have heard that Japan surprisingly fell in the gender gap ranking. It was produced this week by the World Economic Forum. No surprise to people who are on this briefing. Japan now ranks, out of the 146 countries that were evaluated and surveyed. They produced their results on Thursday, and Japan came out 125th in terms of gender equality. So this is 9 positions lower than it was last year. And they did a pretty thorough analysis in terms of political representation, the number of women who are participating overall in the political process. They rank 138 out of 146? That's not very good. And in terms of economic participation, that means people who are sitting on boards, who are running companies, they ranked 123rd out of 146. So for a little bit better breakdown on the political side, there are only 5.7% women involved in the political process overall. That means in the national and the local level. There are only 10% in parliament, and that's why whenever you see a picture of the prime minister in the cabinet meeting, he's got Mr. Hayashi, the foreign minister, on one side of him, and he's got a female cabinet member on the other side of him. So he needs to kind of project this and promote this. Only 10% in the cabinet. It's okay, I guess. It should be more, but it doesn't seem to be making much headway. And in the ministries, it's 8.3%. So 8.3% of the cabinet consists of women. And in the economy, there are 54% women who are participating in the workforce, but only 12.9% who are in executive positions. That's got to change. The Japanese government put out a paper last week that said of the companies that have 100 or less employees, by 2030, they need to have 30% women in the executive, in an executive capacity on their boards. These are for the listed companies on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So within the next 6 years, you're going to see great changes there. If you're involved in politics or in quasi executive management, I think the prospects look good for you, but the Japanese government really needs to do more on this. In terms of globally, the United States ranked 43rd and Italy 79th. So among the G7, Japan is clearly the laggard at a 123, the position of 123. Italy is second with 79. The United States is third. Of the top winners, Iceland came in first for the 14th year in a row. Norway and Finland came in second and third. So there's something going on there. The World Economic Forum predicts that in order to address this issue, it will take 131 years to close the gender gap globally and 162 years in the political arena. So when they finally achieve that, you'll be about what, 28 or 29 years old, I think.
Right.
It probably didn't escape your attention that Carlos Ghosn filed a lawsuit in Lebanon just this last week, $1 billion damages claim against Nissan, 12 individuals, and 2 other companies. And I think I can guess who those companies are. One would be a law firm. And the 12 individuals are mostly, but not exclusively, executives that still have some role in running Nissan. So this will be a pretty spectacular issue that comes up. Already there are people that are throwing barbs at Carlos Ghosn, saying, you know, he did this and he's a self-promoter and that sort of thing. And then you've got people on the other side that are saying, you know, go get him, and what a nasty thing that happened to you, and how did the company and the government collude so seamlessly to bring down this this icon and to create so much controversy. But for those of us who were involved in that, it's hard to be on the sidelines or to be ambivalent about this fight. So it will be long and protracted. There will be a lot of mud slung around. It's too bad for Carlos Ghosn that he's lodging that lawsuit in Lebanon, which doesn't have an extradition treaty with Japan, obviously. But the likelihood of him winning and gaining that kind of damages and having Nissan pay for it is very unlikely. But it is a fight that he's going to have. I think it's probably his goal in life to kind of rectify what was done to him. So we'll continue to watch that. It is interesting on social, legal, and political levels. So it's interesting. For those of you who have been watching our briefing, you know that NATO has been gradually increasing its presence with Japan. Japan has been participating. The Prime Minister went and physically joined the NATO summit last year in Switzerland. It was the first time for him to sit in the NATO summit. He's invited again this year for July 11th and 12th. And NATO has, well, perhaps the Prime Minister has suggested that NATO open an office in Japan. That's created a lot of controversy here in Japan, also with France. France is opposing that. France probably has veto power to allow Japan to create this this entity in Japan, but I think it's going to happen. In the meantime, there has been a formal partnership formed by Australia, New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan, these four countries called the Asia Pacific Four, to be in a special program called the Individually Tailored Partnership Program by NATO. It's been under discussion. It is now formalized, and NATO will be having much more viable relationships with these four countries in the Asia Pacific. They are not part of NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this is Asia. France is opposed to it because they say, what the hell? You know, you should focus on the Transatlantic Alliance, which we're already focused on, and they're already accommodated there. But I think there are greater things that are going on in the background, and I think you know pretty much what we're talking about here. This forming of a coalition of like-minded countries, monitored and driven by the United States prominently, to have this kind of coalition against China, less so against Russia, but certainly including Russia, to have this detrimental impact on China should it want to move more aggressively on Taiwan. So they want to have this kind of partnership, this new partnership, to develop interoperability, to perform, have a platform for energy, sharing information, improving situational awareness, and also to facilitate cooperation on transnational issues, for example, freedom of navigation. This is a precursor of something else that's coming along that you need to be prepared for. This country that many of you joined when Japan was under less than 1% of GDP for defense-related expenditures is vastly different than it was when you first came here. In Japan, as a country, is changing very quickly. It needs to generate an homegrown defense industry. And so the Japanese government is allowing for subsidies and engagement for companies to produce defense-related products. And most of the time, the high-end stuff is either imported from the United States or Israel or some of the high-end performers. And Japan needs to develop those for themselves and also for an export market. So what comes with this is a revision to the Japanese Constitution, Article 9, that allows for Japan to hold more than just the self-defense forces. It doesn't have an army, it has a self-defense forces. It is not allowed to have offensive capabilities. And that's very quickly where it's going now, and this association with NATO is a component of that. So when we talk about what's going on with Mr. Kishida, what's going on with the cabinet, it is always with this kind of seed in the back of our minds that Article 9 needs to be revised. The LDP, one of the principal concepts of the LDP was to revise Article 9 when it was first formed. When the two Liberal Party and the Democratic Party joined, they came up with this plan to revise the Constitution. It has not been revised in 74 years. So there is a distinct march forward with that. It's kind of like the frog in the water. It happens gradually. It is a big deal to get this kind of a revision to the Constitution going. As you know, it requires a referendum. It requires 2/3 of the lower house and 2/3 of the upper house. So what goes on in Japanese politics within the factions, the Komeito LDP relationship, which we're going to get into a little bit, is critically important in reaching that level. Once the level is reached, then you can expect and anticipate that there will be a movement to revise Article 9. It's not time right now. The snap election didn't happen, so the LDP is not going to be in a position to move on that in the lower house. They don't have 2/3, even with their coalition partner. So there's much more to be seen there. Let me see. This idea of incorporating the Asia Pacific Four began last year, and it's going to continue to go forward. The Prime Minister is scheduled to visit the Middle East, I believe, in early July. So that's probably maybe not next week, the week after that. And then he's got a very short schedule before he goes to Lithuania for the NATO summit. So there's a lot going on there. We'll continue to report on that. Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on with the Prime Minister. For those of you who might not know, I grew up on the island of Okinawa. I lived there from the time I was 10 years old, and I left the island when I was 16. So a lot of what happened in Okinawa and Okinawa's role in this geopolitical mix is something that's very close to my heart. The Diet ended their session on the 23rd, just last week on Wednesday. Coincidentally enough, this is also the day that the battle for Okinawa ended on June 23rd. It was the largest Pacific battle during World War II. Probably, about 90% of the military participants in that battle died, and about 2/3 of the Japanese population who were participating in that also perished. So the numbers that died, it was a 3-month battle, as you might know, where the invasion increased onto the shores without too much opposition. And then once the battle started, the kamikazes started. I've read a couple of reports where people were saying that, the kamikaze attacks in Pearl Harbor didn't have any kamikaze attacks. The Japanese didn't need to sacrifice their planes. Kamikaze came much later in the war, but boy, they really punished the United States in their invasion during the Okinawa invasion. The greatest number of military losses in Okinawa were on the sea. Typically, most losses are on the land. The Navy and the Air Force doesn't suffer an outside balance of land fighting and sea fighting. But in Okinawa, the vast majority of the people who were killed were on the sea due to kamikaze fighters. And it was just a horrible situation all around. The Prime Minister was in Okinawa this last week to memorialize that. They had a ceremony at the Peace Park. If you've never been to Okinawa, you should visit it. It's a tropical island that is suffering from the presence of, the U.S. military. It's unmistakable there, but also the Peace Park is just an incredible place with just row after row after row of marble slabs that have the names of the people who died in Okinawa. It's a very moving experience, but I encourage everybody to kind of check it out. Okinawa, 78 years ago, the battle ended just this last week. And as a consequence of that, here we are today. So who would have figured? The Prime Minister is suffering from low polling numbers. G7 gave him a little bit of a boost. He was in the 53% approval rating at that point. It fell really quickly after that. The first thing that happened was his son. Well, it didn't happen quickly after that. His son had a family party at Christmas 7 months ago, where he invited members of his family and friends, and it was reported in Bunshun maybe 2 weeks ago, and that really hammered the Prime Minister, and he got a lot of criticism for it. He had to fire his son as his secretary in the Prime Minister's office, force him to go back to the regular Diet office, and that hurt him pretty greatly. So the rise that he got out of G7 dissipated pretty quickly, not just because of his son, but also because of what's going on with the My Number system. So if you're not following it very closely, My Number is the kind of Social Security card that is voluntary participation. The Japanese population, 73% of the Japanese have signed up for the My Number card system, but they passed a law just in this Diet session that melds the health insurance card with the My Number card. So although My Number is a voluntary card, if you're going to meld it and incorporate it into the healthcare system, into the health card system, it becomes in effect mandatory. So it's kind of a slick step if you're following my logic here. So it's caused a lot of consternation, not just because of that deft play, but also because it suffered from Um, strangely enough, I think everybody's going to laugh here. There have been mistakes where people have the same last name and the same first name printed on their card, and the card readers read them as the same person, and they build the numbers or they build the expenses to one card, or they identify somebody as somebody that they're not, even though they have the same first name and last name. Given the number of and variety of last names in Japan, you can imagine that that's something that's obviously a risk to happen under a system like this, where 125 million people are incorporated into a social security system. This social security system is run by Fujitsu. The technical is run by Fujitsu hardware, and the input is being done by people who go to the ward office or to the legal affairs office to register for this, and then it's hand entered into the system. So mistakes will be made, and it became a huge controversy just this last week because 2 instances of the same name appeared, and it created a big brouhaha. You would think that that's not such a big deal. It's just 2 people out of the several millions that are already in existence, but it did cause a lot of controversy. Egg is on the face of not just Konotaro, who is the Minister of Digital, the digital agency, but also for a couple of the other ministries, not just the Ministry of Health, but Internal Affairs as well. So with 77% of the population assigned to that, between October 21 and November 22, a 1-year period, there were 7,300 issues that had a problem with my number. This is before the incorporation of the healthcare. So now with 770 cases where actually people were billed because they didn't register appropriately with the healthcare system just recently. Now people are saying, I don't trust the system. I don't trust the government to do the right thing with this. It's a dangerous movement forward. And this is blamed. It's kind of blamed on Konotaro and the Minister of Health, but really the blame goes to the Prime Minister. And that is one of the reasons why his numbers are down low. So the latest poll that just came out this week puts him at about 46-47%, but there are other polls. Yomiuri put him at 38%. That's a precipitous drop. And this news came to him at the time when he was thinking of having this snap election. So if you put yourself back to where we were this time last week, the Diet had another 3 or 4 days left in the session. He was still playing and toying with the idea he's going to call a snap election at the end of the day, at the end of the session, 150-day session, or perhaps extend the session so that he can get a couple more of the bills passed and then call for a snap election. That idea was thwarted because the Emperor and the Empress visited Indonesia. They came back on Friday. So he was kind of hampered there. And I think just everything in the mix forced his hand not to call for a snap election and to just close down the House on schedule on Wednesday. But he's got a lot of issues that he's fighting here. But the 150-day session did end on Wednesday on schedule. There were 60 bills that were promoted. You might remember us talking about Mr. Hagiura, who is the individual who's within the LDP structure, the LDP party structure, not on the cabinet side, but on the party side, who initiated and publicly said, we're going to pass 60 bills this year. They were somewhat successful, 96% successful. They passed 58 laws, and we kind of know what they are. The security legislation, the LGBTQ legislation, the immigration legislation, the asylum legislation. There's a lot of stuff that they did. Last year, when they ended the Diet session, they passed 100% of the 60 bills or the 61 bills that they promoted in that session. But this year, there was a lot going on with the Prime Minister. And let me just highlight some of those to kind of wrap up what this 155th session kind of looked like for the Prime Minister. You might remember that very quickly after he took office, within within 2 or 3 months, he had to dismiss 4 of his ministers for a variety of reasons. And that's never happened in any prime minister's reign. Dismissing 4 ministers in their reign is almost unheard of, but within a 2-month period for that to happen has never happened. So he was battling against that. The Unification Church, as you might recall, the prime minister was assassinated, and all of a sudden the Unification Church turned into this huge issue. He had the local elections and the elections for the upper house very, very close coming down to him. And the Unification Church was a huge issue there. It caused a lot of consternation and kind of this bloodletting where the members of the LDP were forced to disclose in kind of a public way what their relationship was with the Unification Church. So a couple of the ministers resigned as a consequence of that, and then a couple of the ministers who are still in their positions or within the LDP still have that kind of dirt on them. They're trying to diminish it by just not talking about it, but the Unification Church still remains to be a contentious issue. The Abiy assassination, then this idea about defense spending, we're going to take it from 1% to 2%, became a huge issue under the Kishida administration. And right now, we've passed the law. We've decided how much money it's going to be for the next 5 years, 4 trillion every year for the next 5 years. But in fact, in the first year, it's going to be more than 4 trillion just to get the pump primed. But it is a huge deal for Japan to kind of absorb that and to kind of engage in a military twice as large as what they initially started with. And it has implications with their relationships with, for example, Australia and Britain and the amount of naval forces that are coming here. So we talk about that pretty frequently. The fact that nuclear power plants will now be extended, their life term will be extended to 60 years. This is pretty significant for these plants that were built to last 30, 40 years. Now they get a lease on life. It's going to go 60 years because they just can't construct them, given what happened with 311. The asylum law passed. There was a no confidence motion that was filed, and it failed just this last week. So I guess good for the prime minister to defeat that. He had to have a coalition of other opposition parties to defeat that. G7 in Hiroshima was a big boost for the prime minister, not enough to get him over the hump. He visited Kiev, and also Zelensky visited Japan during the G7, so he got a lot of boost out of that. He suffered from poor ratings throughout his administration this last year. So who knows how it's going to tumble out as everybody is now on vacation. So the by-elections, including 5 by-elections for members of the parliament, 1 member of the upper house, and then 4 members of the lower house. The LDP was predicted to do well. They did pretty well during the by-elections. Ishin did win another governor's seat. They were able to coalesce. Ishin has a majority in the Osaka parliament, or the Osaka municipal government there, plus the governor and the mayor. So Ishin is a bit on a roll there, and a little bit, the LDP is forced to look over its shoulder and wonder how it's going to be doing things. And so right now, the diet ended on Wednesday. So there are 465 members of the upper house and 248 members of, did I say that backwards? There are 165 members of the lower house, and there are 248 members of the upper house. These guys are now kind of released. They're on vacation. Everybody's going back to their constituencies to kiss babies and to do favors for people and to just relax. It's been a tough 150-day session. Typically in the Japanese calendar, there is their first session, which was the 155th session. There's a break until maybe August or September. They come back, they might pass a supplementary budget, but distinctly they will close the House before maybe November or December with perhaps another session. And so the prediction now is that it will be a little bit quiet for July. The prime minister will be traveling. A lot of the ministers and members of the Diet will be going on junkets. They'll be visiting, other places in Japan, but also making foreign visits as well. And then we can anticipate that probably in August there will be a change in the cabinet. The prime minister dearly wants to change his cabinet. He's been relatively scandal-less, not so many scandals in his cabinet, except for the 4 that had to resign. But it's been a pretty tight ship. But I think part of that is because of the way the communications are handled and the way the press is reporting on it, which means that once again, Bunshun kind of rises to the level of, being the alternative voice of, other news that is happening. You need to take that into mind, a little pinch of salt with it. But it is something that you need to watch. So the biggest thing coming down the path, probably in August, late August, is a cabinet reshuffle. And the biggest issue there is who's going to be Secretary General of the LDP. As you know, right now, there are 6 formal factions within the LDP. There's the Abe faction, which is the largest with 100 members. There's the Aso faction with about 58. And there's the Motegi faction. There's the Kishida faction. And there's the Moriyama faction. So the players, the named individuals here, the Abe faction doesn't have a named individual. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But the named individual is usually the one who is going to be named as a presidential candidate for the LDP and thus prime minister, or somebody who is going to have a cabinet portfolio. And the reason why Motegi is an issue for Mr. Kishida is, number one, Mr. Kishida doesn't, I don't know if he doesn't like or doesn't trust Mr. Motegi because he knows he's coming at him to be the next prime minister. So he needs to keep him close by giving him a position of great authority where he needs to interact with him on a very close basis, weekly at least, if not daily sometimes. But it is a very powerful position. And the person who typically holds the position of party secretary is a candidate and frequently becomes prime minister. So the prime minister kind of doesn't like that. The Motegi faction is a little bit bigger than his faction. He's a bit worried about that. And if he has a cabinet reshuffle, he wants to change out Motegi and give somebody else a chance, somebody else who is closer to him that owes him more gratitude than perhaps Mr. Motegi does. But there's a problem here in that Mr. Motegi has already been foreign minister. He's already been Meti minister. The only other place he could put him, he can't just ignore him. He doesn't want to keep him where he is maybe Minister of Finance. And that position has been held throughout the entire Abe administration, throughout the Suga administration, by Mr. Taro Aso, who is the leader of the second biggest faction in the LDP. Mr. Aso isn't the head of the ministry at this point. His number 2 or 3 in his faction, Mr. Suzuki, is his stand-in, I guess. But he was appointed by the prime minister to be Minister of Finance. So there might be a change in the Minister of Finance, but I think the prime minister is really having a hard time figuring out what he's going to do with Motegi. If he treats him differently or just doesn't give him a position, it could cause some angst and some animosity. So there's some real concern there. The big issue now is watch what goes on with the cabinet reshuffle. There are 2 contenders for replacing the Secretary General. One of them is Mr. Moriyama, who is the leader of the smallest LDP faction, but he's also in charge of election districts throughout Japan. And Mr. Moriyama is very close with the prime minister. The prime minister has awarded him with this party post for elections as a bit of a reward and also to keep him close. And the second person is Miss Obuchi, Miss Yuko Obuchi, who was the daughter of the former prime minister Obuchi, Mr. Obuchi, who died in office. So you might recall that we talked a little bit about Mr. Aoki, who died last week or 10 days ago. Mr. Aoki was the leader of the Motegi faction before Mr. Motegi became the leader. He retired from politics, but he was engaged. And I think he had some sort of an obligation to protect and promote the prime minister's daughter, Yuko Obuchi, as she rose up through the ranks. So she's been a member of parliament for 7 times, I think, 7 times, 8 times. And Mr. Moriyama has been returned to his cabinet, his diet seat 7 times. He's 77 years old. She is 49 years old. Remember this discussion we had about the gender gap and the number of women that are involved in politics? If I had to give my my guess now, I would put my money on Yuko Obuchi to be a contender for Secretary General, priming her for a potential race for Prime Minister at some time in the near future. So it is something to keep an eye on. And also these individuals, Ms. Obuchi, Mr. Moriyama, Mr. Motegi, these are individuals that are not going away, but what the Prime Minister decides to do with them will tell us a lot and also indicate where the LDP is going. I think it's the last thing I want to talk about today is the Abe faction, which has remained leaderless. And what I mean by leaderless is they have a coalition of very committed, very bright, very powerful individuals within the LDP, within the Abe faction, who are managing and guiding that relationship and the relationship with 100 other members of the Diet. But they don't have a single person that is the name or the person that maybe the Prime Minister talks to on a regular basis. So there's some movement going on there. The LDP decided, Mr. Moriyama actually decided just this last week, that within Yamaguchi, which has one of the prefectures, one of the election districts that is going to disappear and be melded together. This is the former district where Mr. Abe held his seat and the district where the current foreign minister, Mr. Hayashi, holds his seat. Under 1010, the gerrymandering rule, this is going to be melded together. And Mr. Moriyama decided, and the LDP accepted his proposal, that the candidate that the LDP is going to have for this melded group is going to be Mr. Hayashi. It's not going to be the person that was selected by Miss Abe to replace her father, her husband, as when he was assassinated. That Diet seat came open. She promoted this individual, Mr. Yoshida, and the fight was between who's going to be the candidate for this coalesced group. And so Mr. Yoshida will go to the proportional representation when there is a election for the House. And I think this is also one of the reasons why the Prime Minister decided not to call for a snap election, because he's going to be confronted with that issue with Mr. Hayashi, who is number 2 in his political faction and foreign minister, and Mr. Miss Abe's vote for Mr. Yoshida, who has the endorsement of the Abe faction, 100 members in the parliament. And so that he wants to avoid that confrontation. He cut to the chase, and the LDP has selected Mr. Hayashi, strangely enough. So there is more wind going on there with Mr. Moriyama as a potential candidate for the Secretary General, even though he's 77 years old. But it is something that is really interesting. The other thing that I want to close up with is there has been a couple of ideas floated that Mr. Suga would come in and rescue the Abe faction and be their titular head so that they can get their act together and they have one person whose voice they can speak through. That was one idea that was put forward. Mr. Suga doesn't belong to any political faction. He has maybe 30 or 40 or 50, it depends on who you talk to, people who are have a relationship with him, not a formal relationship. Perhaps they belong to other factions, but they want to be tight with Mr. Suga. So the idea that, and he was Mr. Abe's choice. It was Mr. Abe's right-hand man. When Mr. Abe was in the hospital, he resigned as prime minister. It was Suga that went back to him and said, boss, you've got to go back. You've got to run for prime minister again, and I will be there with you. And he encouraged him, and he did, and he became his secretary general throughout the entire process. When it came time for an election for prime minister, he voted for Mr. Suga. Mr. Suga became prime minister, even though he doesn't have a political faction. So the idea that Mr. Suga has the mantle of authority of Mr. Abe, isn't that a good idea for him to come in? We don't know how that's going to shake out, but the anniversary of the assassination is coming up very quickly. The other thing that is coming up is that there are 5 individuals within the LDP that are senior, that have the political power, that have been in the Diet long enough, that are managing the operation and the management of this 100-person faction. Some of them are in the upper house, some of them are in the lower house. The people who are in the upper house all fall under the kind of the mantle of one of the members of the Abe faction. And it is his idea that perhaps the upper house portion of the Abe faction just break away and they set up their own faction, which would split the Abe faction in 2. We don't know if that is it is an option that has been talked about. And the reason that option has kind of come up is because while the prime minister has never come from the upper house, if you want to run for prime minister, you need to be from the lower house. So Mr. Seko, who is the leading contender within the LDP faction, the Abe faction, who is from the upper house, if there was a snap election, he was going to resign from the upper house and run in a lower house election, which obviously he would win. And that would have been his play. Since that the prime minister didn't call for a snap election, that chance for him is not going to materialize. The idea is, and it's being talked about very quietly and carefully, is that he would form a faction within just the LDP with the parliamentary upper house members who belong to the Abe faction and have a breakaway group. We don't know how that's going to go, but distinctly something needs to be happening with the Abe faction. Without somebody who's to speak for these 100 members, it's very difficult for the prime minister to really make any decisions or to be very aggressive on a lot of different issues. So that's basically my briefing today. There's a lot of other things I'd like to talk about. What's going on with Komeito, and is this alliance going to live very long? There are some cracks, some serious cracks in the facade there, and also this growing power of Ishin. Is that a viable alliance partner for the LDP? Let's push that off maybe until next week or the week after that. But I think I've gone on a little bit long today, Maya, with apologies, and I hope it was okay for everybody in the audience. And also, if you have issues, if I'm talking about something that you're not interested in, or if there's something that you're more interested in, or you want me to shut up about this, but talk about this, please let Maya know, and she will wrap me over the head, and I will follow her advice. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you for the informative session. The briefing was really great. Okay, yes. So we will continue with the questions and answers. We already have a couple of them, and of course I have a couple of them for you too, but yeah, anyway. So let's see. The first one comes from Clubhouse, that's Gerard, and he says actually, oh, it's a comment, excuse me. Yes, the Kenko Hoken, the health system double records, confused records remaining. Oh, okay. That reminds me of the 2007 pension system, 50 million missing floating records scandal. But ironically, in that case, because of too many readings of Chinese characters and no unifying my number system, some people had many numbers.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah, it's really curious. Sometimes when there's money to be made, all of a sudden the money disappears. The people who have made the money don't seem to have any repercussions. This system, this national system for 124 million people being operated by Fujitsu, you would think that they would really double down on supercomputers. They would make it easy and well integrated. It doesn't look like it's quite there yet. I think they're trying to save a little bit of money in the implementation phase. And the other thing that that really, I think it's a lesson here, is that the Japanese just have little tolerance for government mistakes. You know, Japanese people, typically they're very detail oriented, but when the government makes a mistake, boy, they come out and the knives come out of the sheaths, and they're really critical, and the prime minister's rating goes down. And also Kono Taro, somebody that we love to talk about because he's very familiar to us. He is a candidate for prime minister. Until he becomes prime minister, he will be a candidate. But this issue with the My Number has diminished his star greatly. So if there was a snap election, or if there was an election for prime minister or for party president, his running would have been diminished because of the My Number system. He would receive from his enemies a lot of criticism, a lot of flack from that. So it's not an issue that he likes to talk very much about, but it is an issue he is working hard to resolve. So you'll see him in the press talking about AI and trying to lift up these kinds of conversations and distance himself from the My Number system, which he's, I don't know, maybe rightly so, saying, you know, it falls within the digital agency, but there are 3 other agencies that are involved in Fujitsu. What in the hell is going on with you? So we'll keep an eye on it.
Thank you for that. There is a question in LinkedIn now. They are from Gabor.
Hi, Gabor.
Hi, Gabor. Okay, so is what we see around the candidates in Yamaguchi a sign of the waning influence of the Abe Kishi clan or family?
Yes, it is. So there are a couple of pockets within the 3rd district. So there's District 3 and District 4, and they're being melded together. District 3 was the stronghold of the Abe faction. And this goes on beyond Mr. Abe to his father and to his grandfather. So this battle between these 2 forces, and it was really tough. Before the election law was changed, it really was, you know, one man, one vote, and they fought toe and, what do they call it? Heel and toe against each other. Very famous fights between Hayashi and Abe, and it continues. It's a legacy. So the stronghold for Abe is in election district 3. It's going to be melded together into 4, and it looks like the number of people who voted for Mr. Yoshida, for example, to receive the diet seat of the slain prime minister, Mr. Abe, even with the endorsement of Miss Abe, Akiya Abe, and the prime minister going down there to endorse him, he received less votes than the prime minister, Mr. Abe, ever received in that district. So it doesn't look like he has the whole woomph. There were other candidates that were running. He was the top contender. He won that seat. But I think he's, I think people just, the Abe, the people who aspire to the Abe family, the strength of the Abe family, and also there's a lot of bleeding between the Abe family and the Hayashi family, even between those distinct election districts. Now it's become more clear, and it kind of does tell you that as you would expect, if Mr. Abe is out of the picture, he's not doing favors, he's not kissing babies, he's not bringing money into the prefecture, it will wane very quickly, especially if you got somebody that's aggressively working that angle for you and whose boss happens to be the prime minister. So I guess it's something that is inevitable. But I think the Abe faction, with regard to what their standing is in the current election district 3, is on the downswing. You're right to point out, Gabor.
Well, how about, we know that the other members of the family actually are in politics, but does it make any difference?
It does make some difference. In one of the contiguous election districts there, Mr. Kishi, who was the defense minister, who is Mr. Abe's younger brother, he retired. He wasn't feeling very well. He was walking with a cane. Younger brother from Mr. Abe. And I guess you've got to imagine he was devastated with the assassination. But I don't think that was the critical event that had him retire, but he retired in this last election and put his eldest son up to take that position. Obviously he won. I mean, that kind of legacy, that kind of connection with the defense minister speaking on your behalf and bringing his son and talking to all of the election districts and showing his son how to kiss the babies. That's powerful. That if he had lost that election, that would have been pretty dramatic and unexpected. So the Abe clan is strong there, but it's a young first-year member of the lower house. He's not Minister of Defense. He's just a first-year member of the Abe faction. So there will be continuing battles going on there. So the current holder of the Diet seat in District 3, when it disappears, he has to run for election again. He won't be going for he'll be going for a representational seat, which is lower in prestige and priority. So you get put on a list, and whoever votes the most for that party, they go down the list. And so he's likely to get elected because his name is on the list, but he's not being elected because of his name value.
I see. Okay, thank you for the answer. We have another question on LinkedIn from Miss Yoshida. I apologize, I cannot read your first name because of the kanji characters. I'm sorry for this, but so Miss Yoshida, she says, okay, just a moment. I went there. Oh, it doesn't move. Okay, she says, I'm not sure the purpose of opening NATO's office in Japan.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of that? Yes.
Yeah, my own assessment is gradual encroachment. That's my assessment, that at some point in time, NATO will meld with the Asia Pacific 4 countries, South Korea, Australia, Japan, New Zealand. And this Borg will be a kind of integrated operation, which is just, I mean, what a powerful force that would be for any country. But also, I think the design is to dissuade China from making any moves on Taiwan. You better not even start it. We've got this whole coalition of forces. We all are, although we might be centered in Brussels, we are global, and we are all integrated, and we all are sharing the same cybersecurity and space force and the satellites and the hypersonic missiles, and how they're being built and operated is being exchanged by like-minded countries. I think that's the role, and I think the NATO office will open. It'll be gradual. They'll play it down so that people don't get too upset about it. But this march that we are witnessing now, it is just the pace is just. I mean, 2 years ago, who would have even imagined this? But it is China, and it is Russia and Ukraine.
Right. Yes, I guess that they're also aiming for security of the sea lines here, and a lot of other things.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And then so we have comments also in Clubhouse and from Hiroko. As for the constitution, constitution revision, the government can just expand the interpretation of the language as they did for collective self-defense. That's Hiroko's comment.
Yeah.
So no referendum is necessary. Yes, that's the end of it. Yeah.
So there's not a question there, Hiroko, but I appreciate your observation that, yeah, it's by hook or crook. They want it done, but they don't want to upset too many people. So the language that is accepted in the referendum, number one, it requires 2/3. The language itself, we're going to amend the Constitution. This is the language we're going to use. That language needs to be passed by 3/4 of the upper house, 3/4 of the lower house, and then it's presented to the Japanese population through a referendum. It's never been run before on a national basis to revise the Constitution. It'll be the first time. And the language, the Japanese population will be asked to vote. Do you approve of this new language that we're going to insert into the Japanese Constitution? And if 51% vote yes, then it becomes law. And so the way that the words are couched and the way that it is later interpreted will be probably two different things. But, you know, they've been working on this for 20, 30 years. The fellow who hired me from Japanese law school, Dr. Nakayama Taro, was the chairman of the Constitutional Revision Committee even before he hired me. So it was an issue that was constantly on the top of people's minds. So it's been going on for a long time. It will happen.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Hiroko-san, thank you very much. That was you on LinkedIn eventually. And once again, apologies for not being able to read the kanji characters of your first name. So I will remember that. Okay. So yes, and then okay, another one from Gerard. Okay, it is not Japan, but now you mentioned NATO. Timothy, tell us your read on the Wagner attempted coup.
Woo! Woo!
Oh, that's way beyond Japanese politics, Gerard.
Yeah, it really is. And it's so fresh and it's so, I mean, this has only exploded over the last 48 hours. So I'm not in a good position. It's not my area of expertise, but it is a huge issue. And I've been following it very closely, but I'm not really in a position. It's out of my area of expertise. So forgive me for not going in. But if there's somebody here in the room that can provide some added context or insight, if you can get past Maya, you know.
Yes, sure. You can get past me if you raise your hand there. So that's not such a high hurdle. Please don't worry. If somebody wants to comment on that, you're welcome to do that in Clubhouse, or any other platform which we are on at the moment. But otherwise, yeah, it's way beyond Japanese politics, isn't it?
It is.
Yes. Okay. And then we have also, I have a couple of questions to you, Timothy. I know that you're already tired. Yeah, forgive me for that. But however, so we know that Mr. Kishida, he's still trying, or he still aims to achieve amending the constitution before the end of his presidency of the LDP, which is next year in September. And do you think that it will happen actually? Because we know that Komeito is still way opposed to that idea, and we know that, of course, Isshin no Kai is supporting it, but at the same time, it's not strong enough yet. So what are the dynamics there?
So it's not just Mr. Kishida's desire and dream to change the Constitution. It is the dream and the desire and the obligation of every prime minister from the LDP to change the Constitution. So a lot of the decisions, a lot of what is done, what is revealed, what is left unrevealed, is to change the Constitution. That is why we have this coalition with Komeito. And as you said, yeah, dealing with Komeito, it's good on one side, it's kind of not so good on the other side. And with regard to constitutional revision, you have to really walk on eggs. They might be able to bring you the 2/3 in the upper house and the 2/3 in the lower house, but they're not going to agree to the language that you want to promote so that you can misinterpret it later. They're just not, they're not along for that ride. And the reason why we focus so much on this alliance between Komeito and the LDP and how it's going and who likes who and what are the election districts and who's going to help who, it's really important because the alliance is beginning to fracture. Komeito adds maybe 30 diet seats to the coalition compared to, you know, the LDP, which has, let me see what's the number there, but, 600. So not 600. Anyway, several hundred. And the addition of 30, it's great. It does increase it gives a majority to the LDP in coalition in the lower house and in the upper house. It doesn't give them a super, 2/3 majority. So the fractures in Komeito, it's becoming a little bit more obvious, and the attractiveness of Isshin, because Isshin is also supporting changing the Constitution, as is the Democratic Party, the Democratic People's Party. So Isshin has said, we don't want to join in a coalition. We want to push that off. Mr. Baba, who is the head of the Isshin political party, and who was also, coincidentally enough, also a diet secretary to Dr. Nakayama. We worked together, and he's now the leader of Ishin. He has said it's probably going to take us 10 years before we take over the leadership of the parliament. That means kicking the LDP out. And they're in a 3-step process. They're in the second stage of the process where they try and coalesce as many of their forces as possible in the local elections and in the diet seats so that they can take over and surpass the Constitutional Democratic Party, which is the #1 opposition party. In the next election for the lower house, I imagine they're going to succeed in doing that. And so they want to establish that. That's going to take one election. And then within 2 elections, Mr. Baba predicts they're going to be in a position to not join in an alliance with the LDP, but to challenge the LDP to take over the reins of government. That is their vision. And I think if you're the LDP, what you want to do is, as they get bigger and more powerful, is just, offer them some carrots, some minister portfolios. Komeito is not going to like that. They want to be the only pretty girl on at the party. So Komeito would probably leave, and Ishin would come in more likely than not with more people than Komeito supplies to the mix. And then a referendum will be offered. So that's probably within 2 election cycles, maybe 3. But yeah, a lot to look forward to. And just keeping this dynamic in the back of your thinking helps you understand why certain things happen and why there's a little bit of sensitivity when we talk about Komeito and about votes and election districts, that sort of thing. Maybe it's boring to some people, but it is pretty important in understanding the overall context.
It is indeed, yes. And well, going back again to NATO and Japan's opening office of the alliance here in Japan. So there is a discussion on LinkedIn actually, and Gabor is saying that yeah, it's not necessary actually, because Hiroko-san, she asked about the geographical location. How about, well, Japan has it doesn't face the Atlantic, and it's not on the North Atlantic at all, but there are no geographic requirements there. So there are other requirements for the countries, and NATO has an open door policy. And Gabor is saying that there are no geographical requirements, but in case of Japan, the biggest obstacle would be the territorial disputes with China, Korea, and Russia. New members must have fixed and uncontested borders and normal relationships with their neighbors. That's the comment there. So I guess that, yeah, okay, your thoughts?
Yeah, there is a requirement to join NATO. Not everybody observes it. President Trump, when he was president, brought that clearly to the public eye. You need to pay your fair share, God damn it. You need to pay 2% of GDP for defense. And if you're not going to, then we're going to start billing you. You laggards, get working on it. We're the ones that are providing all of the intel and the hardware, and we're trying to protect you from fights that are in your own neighborhood. And we're the ones that are come on, pay up. So the fact that not everybody pays 2%, but they are compelled to pay at least 2%. I'm sorry, devote 2% of GDP to defense and military spending. The fact that Japan, of all countries in the world, decided, the third economy in the world, so you go from 1% to 2% in military spending, that is huge. But also in the historical context, Japan has never done that. Ever since the end of the war. Of course, there were reasons for that, but also because they benefited from the nuclear umbrella and also the military umbrella provided by the United States. But that also came at a cost. Okinawa was reverted back to Japan in 1972, but it really never kind of became wholly a part of Japan. I mean, the military presence of the United States there is just unmistakable and massive, producing lots of issues, lots of controversy, but it still is, part of the military mix. So going from 1% to 2% is a huge deal. Why 2%? Why that such a huge jump? And I think the reason there is because Mr. Abe, first of all, Mr. Suga, Mr. Kishida have determined that they want to be a part of the grander construct of NATO, and they want to be the key individual, the key country in Asia for promoting defense capabilities and also military capabilities. It's just not going to sit very well with the Constitution that only allows them to be defensive in nature. So I think you can see where the vectors are going here.
Okay, sorry. Yes. Okay, we have a comment from Janusz in Clubhouse that 2%. Okay, so obviously Trump never understood what 2% means. So describing the 2% is not correct. Okay. Well, I guess there is something there. Okay, Janusz, I invite you actually to come up on stage and let us know, because I think that a lot of people, they misunderstand the 2% requirement. And if you can help us with that, please do come up on stage and let us know. And then in the meantime, we also have Gerard once again. NATO opening an office and the changing views about the Pacific Constitution, the pacifist constitution and military spending is not at all unrelated to the Russia-Ukraine war and the parallels with China, etc. This is the opinion of Gerard.
I agree. Yeah, it's not in a vacuum. I mean, all of these things, yeah, they have an impact.
They have an impact, yes, they do. Okay. Well,
before you move on,
yes.
If that's all for Gerard.
For the moment, yes.
Okay. So the other kind of thing here that is in the news is there was a young recruit that just kind of flew off the wire and shot two of his instructors at a firing range and injured another one, a teenager who was recruited into the self-defense forces. He had finished his basic training. This was probably his third month as a self-defense recruit. I think as you move from a recruit, after basic training, I guess you're an official. I don't even know if you call them recruits, but the fact that two people were killed and one was injured is a huge issue. The defense minister had to apologize for that, for the mismanagement of that. It's not particularly his fault, but he takes responsibility for it, just as Kono Taro has to take responsibility for the My Number snafu. But the fact is that the self-defense forces needs to be bolstered with this much money going in for the increases and the technology that's being imported, and also the LDPs and the Prime Minister's desire to create the military industrial complex here in Japan so that they can produce higher end and more technology, and the drone technology and the satellites in the space. This is something that really comes at a cost for humans. And where are these people going to come from when the population is continuing to decline, and we need soldiers to kind of run and operate this? So the fact that, if Japan gets involved in a conflict, even in a support role, and there are defense, maritime defense or land defense soldiers, Japanese soldiers, which I guess they're not even called soldiers. You can't call them soldiers. The self-defense forces who are killed in action. This country is going, that is going to occupy the news for weeks and weeks and weeks, because somebody was killed in a violent conflict that Japan has sworn not to be engaged in since the end of the war. So I anticipate that something like that is going to come up, some sort of a hot conflict, or maybe even North Korea, some of the debris falling and hitting a fishing vessel or something like that. Once you have that kind of activant thrown into the mix, then the conversation about 2/3 in the upper house and 2/3 in the lower house and pushing a referendum through really becomes a possibility. It can happen very quickly. So the fact that this soldier killed two of his instructors, kind of went a little bit berserk, probably means, the number of people who are volunteering to join the self-defense forces is not up to the numbers that they need. Maybe they're being trained a little bit and pushed a little bit too hard. I don't know what the dynamic is there, but there's some real critical issues there in terms of recruitment, in terms of training, in terms of facilitation, in terms of getting them up to speed at a technical level. I mean, that's not just self-defense forces. I think that goes across several layers of industry and politics too. So something to clearly watch for. But it's all part of the mix, as you point out. It's all interrelated. Thanks for the comment, though.
Thank you. Well, great. It looks like there aren't other questions at the moment, Timothy, or... Oh, sorry, we have, okay, from Janusz. Janusz is in at the moment, and he cannot join us, unfortunately. Well, hopefully, Janusz, at some point in the future, I would love to have you on stage. So, okay, let's remember this when it's good for you. Okay, thank you very much for the comment, though. And Timothy, thank you for the briefing. So I can see that you survived this session again. So good for you. Okay, great.
The scotch helped.
The scotch helped. Oh, okay. Yeah, we all have a secret recipe, right, for success.
Maya, before we wrap up, could you promo once again the diet tour and the dinner at the end of this week? It's 5-6 days away.
Yes, sure. So to everybody who is here now listening to us or watching us, I believe that you already know we have a special event this week, next week actually. For me, the week starts on Monday. And the event is on Friday, that's June the 30th. We start in the evening or late afternoon actually with a special diet building tour. Timothy is going to be the leader. As he mentioned in the very beginning, the guards there are going to chase him. So we may have to run after him or try to save him from the guards, but we'll see. So that's
the more the merrier.
The more the merrier, yes. And of course, after that, we're going to have a sit-down dinner, networking event with a fun quiz, of course, but we're going to talk about different things there. So if you can join us, please do. I shared the link here in Clubhouse in the room chat, but you can find the link on LinkedIn as well. Also, you can find our posts on YouTube and Facebook. So I hope to see you there. And that's it for the moment. Timothy?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Please, if there's something that bothers you about the briefing or something you want a little bit more of, or you want me to shut up about, LDP, internal in the weeds politics, let Maya know, and she's going to wrap me on the knuckles, and hopefully we will refine our briefing so that it's more meaningful to you. But also, please tell your friends about, where they can learn about Japanese politics. No place else is available. Nobody else is doing it. So
indeed.
Thank you for signing in.
Follow the story. And thank you very much for being with us on Sunday morning, every Sunday morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. And we'll be here once again next Sunday at 8:20. And before that, 8 o'clock on Wednesday with Tim Sullivan, we have another room there. It's going to be an open room. However, stay tuned. And once again, thanks again. Have a great Sunday. See you.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Timothy.
See you next week.
See you next week.